So, do you like to tell stories? You like to read stories? I didn't bring any objects. One of the things that was suggested for children for a children's sermon was to bring a bag of objects and have someone start a story, pick an object and start a story, and the next person picks an object and adds to that story. Um, all the way up to you just do a round robin story where one person starts it and somebody adds a sentence to it and so on. That was too complicated to try to write all that down and stuff tonight, so we could really enjoy it well. But we'll do that sometime, probably before the parables are over. Um, but one of the basic definitions of parables is short stories. Um, some of the parables of Jesus, especially, some of them are longer than others. Some of them are shorter than others. Um, so there was all kinds of definitions, it seemed like, um, depending on where you were writing from, Old Testament or New Testament, and what the meaning and purpose of your writing was. And sometimes the meaning and purpose of the parable has to do with what the story is about and how long it ends up being. So anything from a phrase or a sentence to a well-involved story. Um, One of the things that I always found interesting was about parables was some of them seem to be quite easy to understand and follow, and other ones not so much. So I guess those are the ones we have to spend some more time thinking about. Um, so when you think of a parable, what do you think of? Do you have a favorite one that comes to mind? Mustard seed? Okay. The kingdom is light. And those are easy ones because they're easy comparisons. Um, and even a few of those get a little lengthy. The one where he talks about buying the field that the treasure is buried in. You find a treasure and you bury it in the field and then you go buy the field. That one's one of those you had to think about. Um, but if you look at all the other ones before that, um, it's by extension, I guess, is one way of doing it. So, what about Old Testament parables?
You caught my interest when you said that. I never think of parables in the Old Testament.
Yeah, there's a few. The one that easiest comes to mind is when Nathan comes and corrects David, tells him the story about the yeah. That's the one that normally comes up, but there were some other ones too. Um, in Judges 9:7-15, Jotham heard. When Jotham heard about this, he climbed to the top of Mount Gerizim and shouted, "Listen to me, citizens of Shechem. Listen to me if you want God to listen to you. Once upon a time, the trees decided to elect a king. First, they said to the olive tree, 'Be our king.' But the olive tree refused, saying, 'Should I quit producing the olive oil that blesses both God and people just to wave back and forth over the trees?' Then they said to the fig tree, 'Be our king.' But the fig tree refused also, saying, 'Should I quit producing my sweet fruit just to wave and back and forth over all the other trees?' Then they said to the grapevine, 'You be our king.' But the grapevine also refused, saying, 'Should I quit producing the wine that cheers both God and people just to wave back and forth over all the trees?' Then all the trees finally turned to the thorn bush and said, 'Come, you be our king.' And the thorn bush replied, 'If you truly want to make me your king, come and take shelter in my shade. If not, let fire come down from me and devour the cedars of Lebanon.'" That was an interesting one I'm not familiar with. I don't read Judges too often, I guess. Been a while, I need to go back. So we'll explore that one at some point next week, probably. But yes, sir. Judges 9:7-15, Jotham's parable. And one of the interesting things I found was that the word parable, um, The Hebrew word parable is translated as proverb. So as we think about proverbs, many of them could be counted probably as parables in the Old Testament. I think a few of them did come up in a list. Um, the most of the Old Testament parables, the majority of them seem to have come from Ezekiel, which is interesting but not surprising, knowing all the imagery that's in Ezekiel. Um, I don't have that list with me tonight, but there'll be a point where we'll get to it. So there'll be a point where we'll get to that list. I'll try to remember to bring it next week, and we'll look at all the individual ones. But um, and some of the definitions for parable was anything from a pithy type memorable statement where the kingdom is like a pearl, or the kingdom, just short and easy to remember and stuff, all the way up to, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 verses, that tells the story. Um, so, one of the most confusing ones for me has always been the cloth and the old garment, where Jesus talks about not sewing a piece of unshrunk cloth. Now that I've sewn more in recent years, I understand it better than I did before. Not from experience yet, but that parable comes to mind when I'm sewing, and so I think about, has this been pre-washed and pre-shrunk or not? Whether it's quilting material or anything else. Um, when Jesus uses the parables, and it's probably true of all the parables, there's a point that's being made. And trying to figure out what that point is sometimes difficult. Some of them are involved, and there can be more than one point, you know, and depending on how involved the story is, like the parables of the seeds that is sown, and the story about the talents that are given out. There's many different levels that you can look at those on.
I think of that when I hear the prodigal son.
Right. Yeah, there's a lot of levels in that.
There's a lot of them.
I mean, you got three perspectives to take the story from to start with, and then applying it to the church or applying it to your own life, So that's the fascinating thing about Scripture is it speaks anew each time you look at it, because you have a different perspective. You can read it this week and read it next week, and because circumstances are different, you're going to read something different. Reading the same psalm every day over the course of the week, you pick up something different in it each day depending on where your focus is at. Sometimes it's because I've read some of the psalms backwards, which say the same thing or say a similar thing, reading it from the last verse to the first verse, not every word backwards or anything like that, but just looking at it from a different viewpoint. Um, then you've got things like figures of speech. Some definitions have parables as a figure of speech, a literary figure of speech, and a literary aid for writing and so on. And this is where it's been a long time since I taught English and stuff, and I'm not good at using good English to start with. So things like metaphors, personification, alliteration, onomatopoeia, just for comparison. Um, so personification is like the chair groaned under the weight of the dog. Okay, you're personifying something into an inanimate object. Um, Aesop's fables come to mind. Anything where there's animals included, you're personifying into the animal world the ability to talk. Trees that could talk, like the last parable there from Judges. There's personification in that because trees don't talk. Um, if the wind blows hard enough, they do. Right, the donkey talking. I think that comes up in here somewhere. Um, Alliteration, Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers. I don't know if there's any alliteration in the Bible. I didn't take the time to look that up, but that might be interesting. In the Hebrew, there probably is some alliteration because A lot of the Psalms and Proverbs and so on are written from a unique perspective, um, where it starts with every letter of the alphabet in sequence and whatnot. But true alliteration, like Peter Piper, where every word starts with that same letter, I don't recall hearing anything, but I'm going to have to go back and look that up. Some of those things I don't think about until I start teaching the class. Um, Onomatopoeia. I remember hearing that word. That was always a funny word growing up. I had to look up what it meant though, because I couldn't remember. The gushing stream flows in the forest. There's a descriptive word that makes a sound, almost makes a sound. Some more so than others. The dog barked. Um, Something about a dog barking. Yeah, babbling brook. Things like that. Hyperbole. Your suitcase weighs a ton. Idioms. He missed the boat. Missed out on an opportunity. Similes and metaphors. There's a lot of those in the Bible. A lot of those in Paul's writings, I think, in particular. I think Jesus had several examples of things, statements that could be called similes and metaphors. Um, Her heart is like gold, which is a simile. Her heart is gold. The difference between like and is. Um, so when we talk about describing things, depending on how you describe it, if you use the word like, you're forming a simile, and if you use the word is, you're forming a metaphor. So I mention all of those because one of our tasks tonight is to describe a couple of objects. Now, my first thought was this thing. This is my go-to object. It's a whatchamacallit. So this is something my grandfather made. And we have no idea what it is, for sure. What he used it for. Really have no idea what it is. But in looking around on the internet one day when I was bored and had time, I think because I was going to use this for a lesson illustration, I ran across something that looked similar to it. They both have lenses. They help you. You look through them. They help you to see better. They both bring things closer to a certain extent, depending on the prescription of the lens. Um, I think in terms of reading, so my reading glasses bring the page a little closer in its own way, the same way that the binoculars bring objects closer so you can see them more clearly. Other ways to describe these two things: how are they different? Okay, one is held in your hands, the other fits over your nose and ears. That's a good point. Size comparison, although binoculars come in a variety of sizes. Um, I guess glasses do too. Right? Right, depending on the prescription and the need. So,
with the binoculars, there's more than one lens for each eye.
More than one lens for each eye. My experience, because I have a lens that pops out of these reading glasses every once in a while, especially if I drop them, And I've learned that you can't see through just one of these lenses. Even though these are just cheap Dollar Tree reading glasses, still both of them, whether it's the glasses that require both of them or whether it's my eyes requiring both of them. So that's a similar thing. We could talk about the material they're made out of, the material the lens is made out of. Okay, we can talk about the collars and stuff. Now, if we were assigning homework and stuff, I would have you take these two objects and try to write a metaphor and a simile and all these figures of speech and describe them using one of those. Each one of them. That would be the challenge. So that would be more like a seminary course level introduction to parables kind of thing. So again, the reason for the activities is to get us used to taking the time to look at the meaning and the words that are used and even the picture that is being described by the story, by the parable, in whatever way, shape, or form that it takes. So a parable is used to teach or illustrate a truth, something that you can relate to, something that we can interact with. So Jesus consistently through his teachings used common everyday objects, common everyday chores, activities, jobs, works, experiences, people, things that anybody could see and recognize and be able to relate to. We don't all have the same experiences in our modern world, I don't think. And of course, that was true to a certain extent in Jesus' day as well. But so we have to find we have to find things that we can all identify with so that we can understand, or we have to use a variety of things. So when you're preparing for a sermon, you try to think in terms of everybody from age 5 to 100, trying to relate to all the different age groups and categories in some way. Whether it's an experience that everyone probably has had, or whether it's using 2 or 3 experiences or whatever, so they can relate to it. So, what other teaching aids might you use to teach something? One of the descriptions of a parable is a teaching aid. Jesus used it as a teaching aid. The Bible includes them as a teaching aid. What are some other teaching aids that we would use? Object lessons, books, other things like that. So that's just giving us another way to look at parables themselves. So a parable is translated as a proverb, but it's also loosely translated sometimes as symbol and comparison. Paul uses the word parable, translated as symbolic, in one of his chapters where he's writing about the layout and furnishings of the tabernacle, probably in Hebrews, and later the temple, which symbolizes God's plan of salvation. So as these comparisons, talking about Jesus being greater than, he's describing the temple and the furnishings of the temple and using that to relate those items that the people would be familiar with from going to the temple, and using that to describe the plan of salvation, kind of thing. So he's not only using the word parable, he's also writing as a parable or a simile, or metaphor, comparing the temple and the plan of salvation. Like we would describe the church, like the church being described as a living body, a living organism. In comparison to things that normally we wouldn't be in the same in the same conversation, kind of thing. A comparison is when we put two objects, place them side by side like we did in the activity. and you think about it and talk about it, but you make a point somewhere along the line in that comparison um, when it's a parable. Obviously, you can compare two different things or two things, apples and oranges, or two kinds of apples, okay? But at some point, you're making a point also when you're talking about it from the point of view of a parable. So, so what does it mean to come alongside and compare something? We've placed the two objects side by side. So when Jesus is talking about the kingdom of God, he's placing the parable, he's placing the kingdom of God beside an object and saying it is like. Okay, um, or he might place an object and the kingdom in the same story and talk about how valuable it is and what its worth is. So how do you illustrate something? Don't mean draw. You're trying to explain something to someone. How do you describe it? How do you illustrate it so they can see it? Huh? Use your hands to talk. Okay, it's a good example. The choice of words, the phrases that we use. Um, you're trying to create a mental picture for that person so they can understand. That's one of the aspects of a parable, one of the things that a parable is used to do. In addition to the figures of speech, these figures of speech are other ones like allegory, and parables, metaphors is one I didn't talk about too much. I think I mentioned it. But think about Pilgrim's Progress. That is an allegory. Um, the story, it's a fictional story based on real life, but yet there's an added dimension that creates this imaginative look at what it means to be a Christian in the world, kind of thing. It too is used to teach a moral. Um, the road to heaven's not easy. Being a Christian's not easy, but if we stick with it, um, God helps us on the way. Um, Other examples of similes or metaphors, we haven't talked about metaphor too much. Paul, I think, uses metaphors probably more than anything else in my thinking. Whether that's true or not, we'll find out in a couple of weeks when we get to that lesson to see if Paul did any parables and stuff. Um, but I always thought about some of his comparisons and stuff are more, to me, seem to be metaphorical. But are there other examples of allegory and metaphors and parables? So parables are not descriptions of true events, but are based on them and told in a way that reveal important truths about human affairs and relationships. But then you have to figure out, well, what's the difference between a parable and a fable? And talking animals, I think, is one, the personification, the abilities given to the animals and so on. The evening. One author said there's three types of parables. There are similitudes, the kingdom of heaven is like. There are parabolic sayings, one-liners like they're found in Luke chapters 4 through 7. And then there are full parables, which are the stories that includes a lot of um, um, detail in the story to make the point. So, thoughts, ideas, questions?